Do you remember a game show that seemed to be on almost every single night in your home? Nothing overly dramatic about it, and nothing built around big exciting climaxes, yet it was always just there. So familiar that you stopped noticing how long you had actually been watching it. Among all the countless shows that came and went over the years, Wheel of Fortune existed in a completely different kind of way. A spinning wheel, letters slowly revealing themselves on the board, and a man standing there calm and almost completely unchanged for decades without needing noise or shock to keep it all going. And yet Pat Sajak appeared night after night for more than 40 years so consistently and so reliably that people completely forgot when he had first become a part of their memory until the day he finally walked away. After season 41, Pat Sajak closed out his journey with a farewell that carried absolutely no drama whatsoever. But that very quiet moment made audiences suddenly realize there was a hole that was not going to be easy to fill. So how did an ordinary man from Chicago who once faced very public failure manage to last longer than almost any other star in an industry that never stops changing and never stops looking for the next big thing? Maybe the answer does not actually lie in what he did, but in how he existed. Quietly, steadily, and in a way that is very unusual and very hard to even recognize when you are looking right at it. Pat Sajak, whose full name is Patrick Leonard Sajak, was born on October 26, 1946 in Chicago, Illinois, into a family with Polish roots. The original family surname included the letter D in its spelling, which was later simplified and Americanized when it started being used on television. His childhood was tied directly to a working-class neighborhood and modest, everyday circumstances. The family lived inside Chicago's industrial environment. His mother worked manual labor jobs, and his stepfather was a freight handler. Before that, his biological father had struggled badly with alcoholism. The marriage between his parents ended when Pat was around 10 years old, and his biological father passed away not long after that. The arrival of a stepfather into his life was not just another change inside the family, but became a way for Pat to slowly relearn what it felt like to have some kind of support, even if it was not whole in the way it once might have been. In the years that followed, Pat's life was not confined just to Chicago. He spent part of his childhood in the San Fernando Valley in California, which was a completely different kind of environment from the industrial neighborhood where he had been born. Moving between those two very different places allowed him to see two very distinct sides of America at a very young age. One side defined by a closed-off and hard-working blue-collar life, and the other much more open and much closer to the world of media and entertainment. From a very young age, Pat was drawn strongly to radio and television. He stayed up late to watch talk shows and woke up early to listen to broadcasts, and he built his own little stage at home using a wooden spoon as his pretend microphone. Figures like Jack Paar and Arthur Godfrey were not just people he admired from a distance, but were the very first clear images of the path he genuinely wanted to follow in his life. Not fame exactly, but the ability to speak to people, to host, and to be present in front of an audience. Those early experiences shaped a very specific perspective inside him. Pat always stood slightly off to the side. He saw the world of television as a place he very much wanted to enter, but not one he felt he completely belonged to. That feeling of being just a little bit on the outside never really disappeared as he got older. It became part of who he was, allowing him, even when placed right at the very center of things, to hold on to a rare and unusual sense of being just an ordinary person. Inside his family, politics was not a big subject. But the Chicago environment of that time carried a strong and familiar traditional Democratic tone around it. His shift in how he thought about things came fairly early when Pat read a political cartoon about Barry Goldwater and realized that the media could seriously distort and twist a point of view. From that moment on, he began leaning toward more conservative thinking, not as some kind of loud public declaration, but as a personal quiet reaction to what he saw as unfairness in how things were being presented. Those early years did not stop at just watching and daydreaming about what could be. In 1965, Pat touched a real microphone for the very first time when he was chosen as a guest DJ on Dick Biondi's program on WLS in Chicago. There was no trembling or nervousness in that moment, and no sense of being overwhelmed by it. Just a completely natural ease, to the point where even Pat himself realized that this was not an experiment he was trying out. This was a place where he actually belonged. He went on to attend Columbia College Chicago, majoring in broadcasting, but his path through education was not a straight, clean road toward success. His very first job at WEDC, which was a Spanish-language AM radio station, was almost a strange contradiction. He read English-language news for an audience that largely did not even understand what he was saying. There was no feedback coming back at him, no clearly defined audience responding, and no real sense that anyone was even hearing him. Yet inside that ambiguity, he quietly learned something far more important than any technical skill. The ability to keep speaking and keep going even when he was not completely sure anyone was actually listening. In 1968, the Vietnam War opened up a completely different and unexpected turning point in his life. Pat chose to enlist because he genuinely believed it was the right thing to do. At first, he was assigned to financial work duties in Long Binh. He repeatedly requested to be transferred into broadcasting and was turned down many times over until an old connection finally helped open a door for him. Armed Forces Radio became the place where he returned to the microphone, but in a context that was completely different from anything he had experienced before. War, the military environment, and an audience that was not tuning in to be entertained, but searching for something that could help them forget for just a moment where they actually were. There he hosted a morning program with the opening line "Good Morning Vietnam," which would later become iconic in popular culture, but at the time was simply his way of starting a new day. There was no stage and no spotlight. Just a voice going out into the air. And it was right there inside those very stripped down and limited conditions that Pat's style became truly clearly defined for the first time. No need to strain for attention and no need to push emotion further than it needed to go. Just keep the rhythm going, keep it comfortable, and keep it steady. He could joke, but not so far that it crossed a line. He could bend the rules a bit, but not so much that it made anyone around him uncomfortable. Moments like pretending to play Christmas music and then switching it over to Led Zeppelin were not just about humor, but a way of quietly testing exactly where his own personal boundaries were. When Pat returned to the United States, the path forward did not open up the way he had imagined or hoped it would. There was no position waiting for him and no automatic stepping stone from his time in military service. He stayed in Washington, D.C. for a time while working night shifts at the Madison Hotel, which had nothing to do with media at all and was simply a way to keep paying his bills. During the day, he kept sending out applications, got rejected over and over, and sent them out again. There was no clear sign that things were actually moving in the right direction at all. He eventually left Washington and made his way to Murray, Kentucky, which was a very small town where he worked night radio for minimum wage. The job was related to what he wanted to do, but not nearly enough to actually build any kind of future from. Realizing he was heading down a dead-end road, he moved again, this time going to Nashville, Tennessee. There he worked at a Howard Johnson's restaurant to support himself financially while continuing to knock on every radio station door and chase every small opportunity he could find. The opportunity finally came at WSM-TV, and it arrived not as any kind of dramatic leap forward, but purely as the result of stubborn persistence. He started out as a staff announcer, which was a job defined almost entirely by repetition and very little room for any creativity whatsoever. But Pat did not approach it the same way everyone else did. He read news scripts backwards sometimes just to see what would happen. He added unexpected little details here and there, and he turned dry routine announcements into something that had actual personality behind it. Not everybody liked what he was doing, but nobody could honestly say he was just like everyone else. From there, he gradually started getting noticed, moved into hosting local programs, and eventually became a weather presenter, which was a step forward. But not because he knew anything more about weather than anyone else did. What set him apart was simply the way he delivered it. He turned a routine weather forecast into an actual form of communication with the people watching. It was during his time as a weatherman, first in Nashville and then later in Los Angeles, that he laid the real groundwork for the biggest turning point of his entire career. At KNBC in Los Angeles, he kept the same style he had always had. Gentle, slightly playful, and never trying too hard to impress anyone. On one occasion, he appeared on air with a bandage on his face, and throughout the entire broadcast it kept mysteriously moving to different positions on his face. Nobody explained it. Nobody mentioned it at all. But it was just enough to make viewers actually remember him. Among the people who happened to notice that moment was Merv Griffin. And with that, everything that had come before, including Chicago, Vietnam, Washington, Kentucky, and Nashville, began to slowly converge towards something much bigger. Even though at that particular moment, Pat Sajak still had absolutely no idea that he was standing right in front of the biggest door of his entire life. Not long after Pat Sajak's name first entered Merv Griffin's field of view, all the seemingly disconnected twists and turns that had come before began linking themselves together. And this time, he was no longer standing on the outside, quietly observing. He was stepping directly into a much larger arena than anything he had ever been part of before. Before Pat Sajak came along, Wheel of Fortune was not yet an institution of any kind. It was a show that had repeatedly wobbled back and forth between survival and cancellation. Merv Griffin's original idea had come from the game of Hangman, but when it was brought to television, the format constantly had to be patched and adjusted, with a spinning wheel added, then shopping elements added, then rules changed again. The early episodes lacked rhythm, lacked a clear focal point, and were sometimes outright criticized for being too slow to hold an audience's attention for very long. By 1980, the show had nearly been dropped entirely by NBC. A farewell episode had actually already been recorded, but just days before it was scheduled to air, the decision was reversed, and Wheel of Fortune was allowed to keep going. But it was existing in a state where nobody was really certain how much longer it was actually going to last. It was right in that unstable and uncertain moment that a backstage conflict created a real opportunity. A dispute over salary between Chuck Woolery and Merv Griffin escalated to the point where Chuck left the show entirely. NBC wanted to replace him with a safer choice, someone with an already established name and real experience hosting large-scale game shows. Pat Sajak at the time was nothing more than a local Los Angeles weatherman, and he was almost not even on their list of options. But Merv Griffin was not out there looking for a famous name to put on his show. He was looking for exactly the right fit. And he chose Pat to the point of actually issuing an ultimatum to the network. If Pat was not hired, he would simply stop producing the show altogether. This was no longer just a regular casting decision. It was a genuine all-in gamble. Pat himself did not step into this with absolute rock-solid confidence. He had actually thought at one point that game shows were probably not right for him. Too formulaic, with too little room to show any real personality. But what made him agree to try it was surprisingly simple. He did not have to change himself in any way. He did not need to become more energetic or more dramatic. He did not need to put on any kind of performance. He just had to stay exactly as he naturally was, the way he naturally spoke and the way he naturally reacted to things. In late December of 1981, he officially stepped out onto that stage for the first time. The first few months did not create any kind of explosion or immediate surge in the ratings. But something quietly started to shift. The rhythm of the entire show began to change. Pat did not try to command the stage the way most hosts traditionally did. He let the game unfold naturally, stepped in only when it was actually necessary, said just enough, and most importantly, never turned everything into some exaggerated, over-the-top performance. That restraint turned out to be the real difference between him and everything that had come before. Audiences started getting